Okay. So we'll jump straight into it. Like today's lecture will be about like argument strategy and how like both throughout the round and like when you're creating your arguments, you can make like certain strategies to like have more paths to victory. So after like each slide, I'll just like pause for like a minute, and if you have like any questions at any moment, feel free to like unmute. If at any time like something I'm saying doesn't make sense, once again just like feel free to unmute and ask me. Okay. So let's start with like argument strategy. There's three main types of like argument strategy. The first is like washing arguments. This typically comes like in terms of weighing when you're trying to like, okay, well this argument is a wash and it shouldn't be like relevant. This is typically like a very defensive strategy. Then is the comparative. You always want to be making comparisons between your case and your opponent's case because like all the time in NYPDL resolutions specifically, sometimes both sides are both like trying to advocate for like the same end goal, but they have very different mechanisms of doing so. So you always want to prove, okay, yours is better, even if theirs achieves the same end goal. Why is yours like so much better? And then like being charitable means like you want to start like with a strong hold, but then you want to like slowly lessen your hold on the argument. So what this essentially looks like is you want to be like, okay, this never happens. Then depending on how the debate is going, you want to change it. This sometimes happens. And then you want to like eventually, if like you're losing that argument, you want to be like, okay, this happens, but it doesn't matter. So like the main key thing is just you want to be very adaptable during round. Okay. So first let's go talk about like washing arguments. As I mentioned before, like washing arguments, I'm not sure like if you like utilize this strategy, but like typically in a lot of like third speeches you'll hear, okay, judge, this argument is a wash and it shouldn't be considered in this debate space. This typically happens when both sides have just been going like really back and forth on like the same one argument and neither side has like a clear path to victory, especially if you're the LO. If you think that the PMR will try to like push this into the ballot, in the LO, it would be very strategic to prove like, okay, this argument is a wash, if that makes sense. Okay, I'll take that as a yes. In the
Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
in like the LO, if you prove that like it's a wash, now the PMR has to do extra work to ensure like, okay, this argument is not a wash, and then they also have to prove why they're winning this argument. So essentially, you just make like the life harder for the PMR. Okay. So the overview of this is that you're like taking the arguments or clashes that you're either losing or you're probably like never going to win, and you just want to make them seem very unimportant in the big picture. By like essentially making them a wash, as I've said before, it means that like neither team can really like win the debate there. And this is like really crucial because many times in debate, you don't need to win every single argument to win the round, but you just need to make sure that like the arguments you don't win don't end up mattering. You never want to have like a judge be like, okay, I think you had this really strong argument, but then because you didn't respond to this other argument, I had to give it to the other team. You always want to hit like every response, but there's some responses that you're just never going to win in the grand scheme of things, right? Like some things are just like a fact or something, and you may not be able to like secure the ballot through argumentation on that specific point, but instead by like responding you can like now ensure that okay, this argument has become blocked, it has become a wash. They now have to do extra work to pull it into a ballot, so like they might not do that, and then you can like end up focusing on like your stronger arguments and the ones that really matter. This is also key for like time management and say like the LO, because if by the MO you're okay, these arguments are a wash, then in the LO you can spend all of those 4 minutes proving your ballots, and you just have four like uninterrupted minutes of like why you should win, and you can go ballot one, ballot two, voting issues. But then now the PMR, they only have 5 minutes to respond to all of your ballots, prove their ballots, and then also prove like if their argument has become washed, why it's not a wash. So just like very strategic as like a general scheme of things. Okay. So first let's like look at this case study number one, which is just like how this house would like ban homework. A general like gov case would be just be like, okay, homework worsens academic outcomes by making students more tired, more stressed, and they're less able to concentrate. And like the uh yeah, sorry. The op case would just be like, okay, homework improves like academic outcomes by reinforcing the concepts like taught in class. So when the washing here, right? would be in terms of academic performance. You see that both cases are saying, okay, one of this is bad for academic performance, the other one is good for academic performance. And then both of them, throughout their cases, they're going to be having a lot of back and forth. They're going to be like, homework is a bad, like, is bad for academic performance because some people don't do it properly. Homework is good for academic performance because like it makes you accountable. And then all these like additional factors will come in, right? Now, logically speaking, unless any one side has like a crazy argument, this is probably going to be a wash because it's going to be very convincing arguments from both sides, especially when the team is like really good, right? So, how is a judge going to make a decision for what is right? Typically, here the judge will end up picking a very minute detail and use that minute detail to like award to their side. So, if as like side opposition you are not confident that you are going to win this ballot, you're going to wash this argument. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, yeah. So like just again the big idea, these two arguments would wash out, so they would like effectively neutralize each other, and like the margin of change in terms of the academic outcomes would be quite small. Now, like the thing you can do by this is this if you can like get rid of like, okay, I'm going to drop the academic performance argument. I don't think that's like a very strategic manner for me to win. And now because I've washed it, I no longer need to care about this argument. This means that I can open the door for like my side to win with a very different argument. So I can talk about like time loss, I can talk about stress, and this would be very like significantly more convincing. And these are like more like fact kind of things, right? Like if you say, okay, homework can cause like a lot of stress because you have to meet all your deadlines. Now it makes it really hard for the gov to actually like combat that argument. So you have like a stronger path to ballot there. So like just like a quick summary by like washing out any of my opponent's like important arguments, I can win with one of mine instead that I feel I'm winning more clearly. So like just as I said before, you always want to make sure you're responding to each and every one of like your opponent's arguments. Even if they have a very strong argument, you just want to have a response on the go. And then you can be like, okay, if you think you're going to lose it, you can end up just washing or dropping that argument and proving why another argument like supersedes this argument. Okay. Um, yeah. So like another case study number two would be like how this house regrets like modern medicine's prioritization of longevity over the quality of life. Oh, actually, I believe I've done this case before, but the quality of life would just be like, okay, or yeah, so like what this would essentially look like is would you rather just prioritize like living for super long even if you have a bad quality of life, or would you just prioritize like having a good quality of life even if this means like you won't live for like 115 years? So like what the gov case would do here, because the gov case would be talking about like longevity, is you would talk about how like the average patient has a preference for quality of life at the expense of longevity, right? So many people would rather enter like hospice care rather than like undergoing a chemotherapy. Or like the op case, let's say patients has the average patient has a preference for longevity even at the expense of quality of life, aka like you would endure a years long battle with cancer. So could you just like give me a couple of reasons why you think like this could be like a potential wash?
Because th there's there's not really warranting on either side as to why the patient has a preference for that thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also like the examples, like both sides have like a fairly like understandable example, but both sides having like a strong example and neither side really having any warranting to show like uniquely why their side is better would also like indicate this is a wash. Also, just in terms of like general arguments, any sort of like preference argument typically ends up being a wash because we cannot control other people's preferences, and like preference is always going to be like dependent on the individual, so you can't just like average it out for most cases. Okay. Uh, yeah, this is we talked about this. So like the solution would just to like win somewhere else, right? Neither team, as you said, can like really prove whether a majority of patients prefer like the longevity of their lives or the quality of their life. But then like other arguments that are like a much less certain So if we make like a different type of argument, we can like sidestep this clash and focus on a different one instead. So when we're focusing on winning like the debate on a different impact, we would just kind of like almost shove this like under the table and kind of ignore this one after proving it's like a wash, and then you can spend your time like actually winning what you can win. So for example, for like the opposition side of this case, you could win on an argument about like how extending patient lives gives like a better understanding of how to combat the disease, which like saves more life in the future. This argument compared to the previous one is like a lot stronger on the op, because I think like in order to like make an argument on the gov, you would have to like make a weird like morals or ethic argument on how like it's not okay for us to like cause bad quality of life for current lives to save future lives, and then that'd be like that's a lot harder to win, if that makes sense. This opposition argument is like a lot more straightforward and clear, so like it's significantly easier for opposition to win on this argument. And then the opposition can talk about how like survival of the future is the biggest impact in this round, and then you can talk about how like you always you can talk about like biology, and you can talk about how we're like built for like reproduction, we're built for like saving more lives in the future, and then you could like have a really solid op case for this. Okay. So just to conclude, washing is like a strategy that you can use if you just want to like kind of delete losing or difficult to win clashes from the round. However, note that it's not a substitute for actual weighing. You still have to weigh out some other clash or other argument, but by washing a clash out, you can narrow the debate to a set of arguments you're more likely to win. So essentially, just to like summarize this, you can use washing as a strategy, but you have to like weigh. Obviously, you can just be like, okay, all my arguments are a wash, because then the judge doesn't know what to weigh on. And it also helps if you just do like a weighing of the arguments against each other, and you can just like, okay, this argument is significantly more important than my washed argument. If you just want to like really nail it down, especially for like parent judges. So do you have any questions on like washing?
Not really. Thank you.
Okay. If you have like any questions on like washing that like suddenly pop up in another part of this presentation, like feel free to just like unmute and like tell me. But yeah. Um okay. So like there's a couple of strategies for like washing clashes. Here we see that we can portray clashes as being like marginal, and we say that the scale or the size of the change isn't large enough for the other team to win. So this is very strategic if like even within the washed argument, one side has like a marginal upper hand. So we can say, okay, even if the opposition side wins this argument, their benefit is so negligible or it's so marginal that comparatively our benefit of something else is just more significant. So this would be what I said before, just like weighing the arguments against each other and looking like, okay, if opposition won this argument, but its like magnitude is so low that like it doesn't even matter in the grand scheme of things. On the other hand, like for our argument number Y, the benefit of it is just significantly more. Okay, so we can also portray clashes as like being uncertain. We can say like the clash is unlikely to be decisive enough for the other team to win. So this we will talk about. Also, you can use like the weighing term probability. You can talk about how like even if op wins X, their benefit is very uncertain or is not likely to happen in the future. So comparatively, our benefit of Y is like much more important. And typically, when you're weighing this argument, a thing you can say to kind of like convince, especially like parent judges, you could be like, Judge, we tell you that the probability of like impact significantly matters. For example, the magnitude of like a car crash is really high, right? But then it's very uncertain if we will even go into a car crash, and it's pretty low probability. So even if they win that car crashes are bad, they shouldn't win like the resolution, or they shouldn't get the side that you shouldn't go outside. Like obviously this is kind of like a dumbed down example and you won't actually have a resolution like this, but it's just like an easy example to show you why sometimes you want to really stress the probability of like an action happening. Okay. Yeah. Have you had like any rounds in the past where you've used like the washing strategy, or you think like you could have used like the washing strategy?
Yeah, for sure.
So number two, we're going to be talking about the comparative. Just give me 1 second. I'm just going to grab a charger real quick.
Eva, you're on mute.
Okay, that's looking embarrassing. So, like, what is a comparative? In every debate, each team kind of stands for something. So, this means that, like, you're not ever just debating, like, a proposal or idea in isolation. You're always comparing the gov world to the opposition world, or the world where, like, the motion passes versus the world where it doesn't. So what each team defends is their comparative, aka the gov world or the op world, and each debate like requires us to compare these two worlds, analyze like what's different, the different types of impacts, and then use that to decide like which world is more preferable. Typically, like in the PMR or LOR speeches, you'll hear it be like world by world comparison, judge this is how we characterized our world, this is the impacts of our world, and we see our world is so much more preferable for like XYZ reasons. Okay. So first, you want to make your arguments robustly competitive. What exactly does this mean? This means that like any argument you make should figure out what the relevant comparison is and explain why something on your side compared to the other side is better or why something is worse on their side compared to your side. This means that whenever you want to have your arguments, you want to structure them in such a manner that not only do they explain the benefits of your side, they comparatively explain the benefits of your side as being better than like the opponent's side. So like an example of what this would look like is say in a resolution about like actually let's revisit the previous resolution about health, about like long-term health versus short-term health. Say one of your arguments is like expenses. You would talk about how expenses is significantly less on like a side where you're not having to do like long-term longevity because there's probably less payments and the payments on my opponent's side are like a lot worse. So you want to be very explicit in the comparison because it just makes your like life so much easier in say the PMR or the LOR. So why does like making your arguments robustly competitive even matter? We tell that comparative arguments paint like a much clearer picture of the scale of your impact since both sides of the story are getting told. Comparative arguments are also harder to refute because your opponents need to prove that that your side is bad and that their side is good. Essentially, this would be a two-pronged attack because number one, you're showing your good impacts, and number two, you're also showing why your opponent has bad impacts or why your impacts are better than theirs. So essentially, say you're giving the first speech, you haven't even heard side negations like arguments yet, but you're doing some preemptive rebuttaling through these comparative arguments. So like let's just look at an example of this. We see that this house supports X thing could be like a resolution, right? So a non-comparative argument would be X thing is bad because it causes Y event, right? It's just like an individual argument isolated on its own, XYZ. However, we can transform this into a comparative argument and make it significantly more like likely to win and also more robust. We can say that X thing is bad because it causes Y event. Without X thing, Y event doesn't happen, and instead Z event happens, which is good. So notice how not only does this argument have a lot more like substance within the argument, but this argument is also like a direct comparative, meaning it's going to be a lot harder for like say your opponent to like have to like rebut against it. Because number one, you're proving why like why the Y event won't happen, and you're also proving why the Z event happening is bad. Okay. So argumentally analyzing the comparative is often like a very useful strategy. And let's just look at like a case study number one. So we can say that this house regrets the glorification of hard work. So like opposition, like ask yourself, what is the comparative? In this circumstance, what this means is that what narrative would have otherwise arisen or emerged if we hadn't glorified hard work? What else would we have glorified instead? Okay. So you can just like take a look at this resolution and think about like what the opposition side would use as like a comparative. And then let me know when you get like any ideas for like what you
Okay.
think opposition would use.
So the comparative of glorifying hard work would be glorifying rest and moderation, probably.
Mhm.
And that narrative might have been harmful because people wouldn't have as much motivation to push themselves and innovate and really be able to compete with others. So you like how they say pressure creates diamonds. Without that pressure, we won't see as much creation.
Yeah, I think that'd be like a very solid argument because again, like in a world where we don't glorify hard work, as we said, we would probably glorify rest. There's no need to say like rest in moderation. Always kind of like your first argument, you should be like very like brutal. No, judge, my opponents glorify rest. And then if your opponents clarify like rest in moderation, then you can prove like why that's still bad, if that makes sense. Also, another like comparative that we can make is when we're regretting the glorification of hard work, we can instead glorify just success. So, what does this mean? This means that people will no longer just use the hard work method to get success because there's been a glorification on success and everybody just wants to like become very successful in the future. Now this can cause people to like use a lot of like loopholes, take the wrong paths, use cheats or shortcuts to achieve the success which they otherwise would not have achieved in a or which they otherwise would not have done in a world where hard work was glorified. So notice how not only did like this comparative show why like their world is like really bad in terms of um kind of negative consequences taken, it also shows how like our world would be better because we're preventative of these negative actions. But yeah. Okay. We can do like another like case study. We can do like this house would legalize all drugs, and then like again you can do the same thing. This time for like the government side, think about like what alternative the negation side can propose and why it would be like bad.
So, ops world is one in which things stay the same, which means that people will continue to be poisoned by laced drugs that they get from dubious sources. But on our side, legalization allows entities like the government to regulate drugs so that addicts and people who are dependent on drugs are actually using them in a safer way. So on our side, things change and harm actually has a potential of getting reduced. But on their side, things stay the same. And problems surrounding addiction and stigma around such a mental illness continues.
Yeah, I think like you hit that one like straight on. I think that's also like the comparative I would have gone for. And it just like makes a lot of sense. When you have like legalization, you obviously have like a level of governmental control. But if you don't have legalization, then this just means things are roaming freely in the black market, which is obviously bad because now you can't control who's actually getting these drugs. And also, another thing you can do to like really emphasize the comparative is I'm not sure about like the East Coast, but like at least in California, there's some drugs that are like non-legalized, right? But then still, like we could talk about how this is the status quo. Some drugs are not legalized, but we see like illegal black market drugs are still like super on the rise. We see people facing things such as like addiction and stuff like in our status quo. So like we have like kind of like tangible proof that like criminalizing drugs does not eliminate them from society, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. And then just like one more, we'll try like another case study. This one is low-key significantly harder, but this resolution is going to be this house supports a mainstream men's rights movement. And just like try to think of something on the government side, but yeah. If you also can't come up with anything for this resolution, that's totally okay. Just like you can give it a try.
So, Gov could argue that a mainstream men's rights movement is one that many people know about. And so arguably if if many people know about it, then at least people are aware and they can educate each other about why that might not be necessary or why or just raise awareness for the life of, and struggles that certain men in society might face. Like the alternative is it being really extremist and developing in corners of the internet that are very unregulated, like 4chan. So at least if it's out in the open, people are aware of what's going on.
Yep, I think like that argument is really solid because you can also talk about how like mainstream typically means more accountability. So this would like ensure like okay, you're constantly in the news as you said, like things are like a lot more regulated and people are like a lot more aware. Also, if you're constantly like in the news and you're very mainstream, this means that you have like press check back, you have people check back, you have government check back, and there's just so much more regulation. On the other hand, if I was like an extremist men's rights movement, this might like provoke me to do more violence and things like that, which are just like negatively bad. So in this case, I would like support a mainstream men's rights movement. But yeah, just like overall, like make sure your analysis is always comparative to the other side, and you can win debates by always considering the counterfactual. Sometimes, even if your impact isn't really high, if your impact is significantly better than your opponent's world, that's often enough for you to win this debate. You don't always have to have like immense magnitude. Sometimes you just have to prove why you're better than like the counterfactual. Okay. Like we did a good amount of drills for this section, but let me know if you still have like any questions on this.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. Um, 1 second. So now our final argument, or final section, sorry, for the argument strategy would be being charitable. So essentially what like being charitable means is kind of like being nice to your opponents would be a way to phrase it. Like part of being a good debater is by being charitable towards your opponents, and there's three major implications in this. The first implication is that you adhere to the principle of charity when making or refuting arguments. This means that like as in you make your arguments and refutations increasingly charitable to the side as you go. So your first response, like as I mentioned before, would be like this is nonsense. Then response or you kind of phrase that better. Then your response number two would be even if it's not nonsense, it's still wrong. And your response number three would be even if it's not wrong, it's not important. So the reason why like following this like charitable like mannerism is really key is number one, you're constantly providing like new refutes to your opponent's like kind of defenses. So you're always having some new response to say, and your opponent is like always having to respond back. On the other hand, if I wasn't charitable, it would just be like back and forth, and I wouldn't have like new argumentation on the flow, so it wouldn't be very beneficial in my case. And the second thing is why you want to be charitable as you go instead of starting out charitable is if in my very first response I say like even if this is not wrong or nonsense, it's just important. Now I've already done like two segments of like the work for my opponents. My opponents no longer have to prove why their argument is not nonsensical or why their argument is not wrong. They just have to prove that this argument is important. So for this case, you always want to follow like this format of like going one, two, three, and decreasing the scale, like or sorry, increasing the charitability scale as you go. Not only does this give you like new responses and offense on your case, this also like allows for just the opponents always have to like kind of respond to you. Okay. Implication number two is that you develop multiple paths to victory, at least one of which takes the other side at its best. Okay. So what this essentially means is that you want to have like at least one argument that's like, okay, judge, let's take my opponent's characterization as it is. Even if their plan passes in its entirety, their world is still bad, and XYZ reasons. So an example of this would be like this house opposes the use of torture in the fight against like terrorism. So first you'd be like, okay, in principle, torture is always wrong and immoral. Then this is going to be like your very non-charitable claim. Then you're going to make it a little bit more charitable. You can say torture is ineffective and doesn't yield any positive outcomes. Right? So you're saying like even if like you use torture, it won't just lead to any positive outcomes. And then finally, you want to say like, okay, judge, even if we take my opponents at the best world where they're using torture to fight against terrorism, torture actively emboldens the terrorist recruitment and misdirects resources in the combat against terrorism. So you're saying that even if you're like taking my opponents at their best world where they actually are using torture in the fight against terrorism, it's going to cause more terrorist recruitment and it's also going to misdirect resources. So you see how there's like three different like scales and levels of like the argument. This is always going to be like your first just like general claim to address, and then there'd be like then maybe your opponent would respond to this claim by saying, "No, judge, there are cases where torture is allowed, and that would be in the fight against terrorism. It's effective." Then like you would respond to that by saying torture is ineffective and doesn't yield any positive outcomes. Then your opponents can be like, okay, it does, torture actually is effective and like yields some level of positive outcomes. So then again, you would respond to this by having a very strong piece of offense and almost like showing why no, it doesn't yield any positive outcomes. Instead, it actually yields bad outcomes. And it would be like a very solid like rebuttal or response, and you just be like, okay, like torture actively causes more terrorism, and it also makes us less likely to succeed in our fight against terrorism by misdirecting resources. So yeah. And the third implication is that you're always going to be conscious of potentially more charitable ways opposing claims could be made or interpreted. So you always want to just think about like what are the other charitable ways you can make your like opponent's claims and use that to respond to you. For example, like you can see a higher minimum wage will increase the amount of money, thus inflation. On the other hand, you can like really expand this argument and be like a higher minimum wage will increase demand and thus spurring demand pull inflation while raising production costs. This would trigger simultaneous cost push inflation, create an inflationary spiral. So you see how like the number two, one, this argument had like a lot more substance, and number two, this argument like shows you why you're having like more inflation, and you're like um it addresses like all the different responses your opponents could make to like this argument, and kind of like preemptively just like hits them. So say like in response to this argument, I would say, well, inflation would be increased because I would like let me just see. A higher minimum wage will increase the amount of that's inflation. For example, I could just say like, oh no, a higher minimum wage will actually increase the money of will increase the amount of money, but it will also increase like the number of products. So like we might not have inflation, right? But then this argument already actively like addresses the increased demand and show why that causes inflation, and then shows why that would create the spiral down. Okay, so we can do like a bit of like drill work with this. Let's take a look at implication number two, just like developing multiple paths to the victory, where at least one of which takes the other side at its best. So for this drill work, we'll just take like a sample resolution and think of like the different paths of victory, where at least one of which is taking the other side at its best. So I hope you probably haven't done this resolution, but one resolution we can consider is, give me a second. Okay. You can say this house, or actually I'll type it in the chat, I'll stop sharing.